Hi, welcome to this panel for the Saints and Sinners Literary Festival. Unfortunately, we can't be in New Orleans this year for this event, and so I'm just very grateful that we can do this virtually. Today, we're going to talk about some things that I think are very relevant and, look at the last 12 months and sort of dissect and try to understand the impact that the last 12 months have had on us as writers and artists. We have two fantastic guests here today who will be just exploring this with me, and I'll talk to you about how this idea came about, and we'll take it from there. So, in the upper left-hand side, we have Cheryl Head. Cheryl's first book, The Long Way Home, a World War II novel, was shortlisted for the 2017 Generation Indie Book Awards in the African American Fiction and Historical Fiction categories. She writes the award-winning Charlie Mack Motown series, whose female PI protagonist is queer and black. The series is included in the Detroit Public Library's African American Books List. Cheryl is also a member of the National Board of Boucheron. In 2019, she was named to the Saints and Sinners Literary Hall of Fame. So welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you. And Boucheron doesn't have the New Orleans vibe, so it's Boucher Khan.
Boucher Khan. Oh, really? Boucher Khan. Interesting. I've read that so many times, and I was like reading it as Boucheron, just being from New
I
Orleans.
love it. That's
Yeah,
a better,
yeah. It's like I'm looking at
better
the French way.
pronunciation.
Yeah, excellent. And I'm gonna ask you in a moment what that is. Okay, so Sassafras Lowrey is there in her beautiful white glasses. I've known Sassafras for quite a while. It's great to have her today. Uh, Sassafras novels and nonfiction books have been honored by organizations ranging from the American Library Association and the Lambda Literary Foundation. Also, the International Leather Association Writing Awards, the Dog Writers Association of America as well. Sassafras's work has appeared in numerous anthologies and publications, including the New York Times, Catapult, Narratively, and The Rumpus. Sassafras has taught queer writing courses and workshops at Lit Reactor, the NYC Center for Fiction, and at colleges, conferences, and LGBTQ youth centers across the country. For more information, you can visit www.sassafraslowrey.com. So Cheryl, tell us what that organization is. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a mystery writers conference, a big one, and I'm on the board right now. It's named after Anthony Boucher, who was a reviewer of mysteries, and so he started. It's been going on for about 50 years. This conference, and it brings together all genre of mystery writers.
Fantastic.
Fun event.
Excellent. No, it sounds great. And I'm sure all the mystery writers are
We'll
like,
be in
oh,
New
yeah,
Orleans.
we all know what that
We'll
is.
be in New Orleans this year.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Very good. Thank you for that. So, as I said, usually, I'm in New Orleans for this and, in person. And every year, I'm asked what, might be some things I want to talk about, either moderating a panel or sitting on a panel. And so this year, when Paul Willis, the executive director, contacted me, I thought, how can we not discuss the past 12 months? How can we not discuss world events and the impact that those world events have had on our writing and on our lives? So today, there's just two ideas I want to throw out there, and then we're going to explore the last 12 months and your lives and your writing lives as well. I'm just curious, I just want you to think about these things. So I often wonder about compartmentalization, in terms of whether or not as, writers and artists, we see the world like everybody else and we just choose to document it, or if in fact our perception is different and unique, that maybe we are more sensitive when we notice things other people don't notice. I tend to believe that way. But in the past 12 months, in terms of separating our personal lives, our creative lives, any other professional endeavors that we might have, those things, with working from home or just the change in the way that we live our lives, those things have sort of become intermingled. And so I think for writers and artists, it's, we have our own unique struggles with all of that. And so I want you to think about that. And then also, I think about just, again, in a historical context. So this idea of in the past, how have artists and writers reacted to major events? Um, you know, and again, keeping in mind, whether or not we can separate that the personal from the creative, or if those two things are interlinked. So that's sort of why I came up with this idea, because I know that I was having certain thoughts about creativity and my own writing during the past 12 months, and so I wanted to hear what other writers were experiencing as well. So that's sort of the background on that. And so, Cheryl, we'll start with you. So, could you just check in and just tell us how have you been, and how have the past 12 months been for you as a writer or just in general?
Mhm. Well, it's a great concept, and the undergirding you gave us really has me thinking about both the personal and the writer stuff. It's been a whirlwind. There were three things going on for me. It was I was in a new relationship. I was telling you guys this, so I was getting adjusted to that, and then social justice stuff was happening. George Floyd, that was February, of last year, and I was really angry about that. And then COVID hit, and then I didn't know how to feel. So it was the first few months. I fluctuated between anger, curiosity, and fear. I guess. I think most of March I was taking my temperature every day and thinking I was going to die. So by April, then I thought, well, I'm not going to die. I'm still angry about social justice stuff, but what is this COVID thing? So I started I settled down, and once I settled down, it became just an eye-opening event for me. I think I've been more creative and more connected to the earth and to people and myself than I've ever been before.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. It's a great sort of self discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sassafras. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the last 12 months have been a very strange period of time. Sorry, is my watch, I forgot to silent, makes
Right.
noise. Goodness. And I obviously I miss being able to go places that I love and that inspire me, but at the same time, something that I'm so aware of is how privileged I am and how privileged I've been in this pandemic. As a, personally and as a writer, in that my partner and I both have worked exclusively from home for years. And so that has, my day-to-day life hasn't changed that much in terms of my creativity, and how I do the work. And then also as a full-time writer, kind of although not what this necessarily the saints and sinners world knows me for, is that a lot of what I do, what kind of pays my bills, is writing about dogs and dog training and life with dogs for national magazines and newspapers. And that has only skyrocketed in the pandemic because more and more people have found themselves with pets in their lives. And so my writing work in that way has been incredibly, incredibly busy since the pandemic began. But similarly to, I think everybody, I'm thinking about everything that's going on in the world, which I know we're going to be talking about on
Sure.
this panel, as it relates to the rest of my work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too. I love that idea of gratitude. This idea of, well, if we're okay in a moment, and maybe we know other people have suffered more, suffered differently. I often think that whenever the whole world's experiencing something, it just has this weight, right? It just kind of hovers and hangs in the air. I was thinking about, for example, on New Year's Eve, for example. I don't like it. It stresses me out because the whole world is self-reflecting, right? They're thinking about their resolutions and what they're going to do differently. And for writers, we do that all the time, right? We're always thinking about our goals and who we are. And so I do think even if perhaps someone is not directly impacted, for example, by the pandemic, just having it exist, right, is sort of a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think everybody was affected by the pandemic. I mean, some people sadly, lost family and friends and loved ones, but because it changed all our lives, because we couldn't go to places we'd been before, and we couldn't see family face to face, and we're all of a sudden wearing masks, and we're staying in our own pods, and all the things that really affect the day to day. I think it really tested the mettle of the world, because this is a global pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. and then this idea, about self-discovery and
Yep.
learning something about ourselves. Sassafras, you said that your work as writing about dogs has, that's kind of picked up and been busy. And Cheryl, you have your first dogs, right? During
I
this
have
time
my
of
first two dogs. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
excellent,
glad to have them. Gratitude for have them during the pandemic.
fantastic, thank you. And also, perhaps this shift of working from home is something that was already going to happen for many people, but it's sort of expedited everything. Suddenly people were forced to work from home maybe before companies had planned on it. And so, in terms of just world events, societal events, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, um, any other things that have occurred in the last 12 months that have weighed on you the heaviest and have perhaps either just impacted you emotionally and or your writing the most? Cheryl?
Well, I was saying to you guys before we started recording that I was demoralized by the Trump administration. I mean, every single day, I was either screaming at the television or just walking around screaming into the air. It was just I wanted to think better of this country. I couldn't understand how someone could be so and selfish and mean and unthinking and still have so many people admire and vote for him. I don't know if I'll ever figure that out. So it really made me think differently about myself as a writer, myself as a person. Toni Morrison talks about writing without the white gaze. I think before 2020 and Trump and COVID and Black Lives Matter, I wrote with an audience of mine of a certain amount of white people because I was writing to teach about tolerance and to inform people about diversity and to talk about understanding other cultures. But now I don't care if they get it or not. I'm just writing what I'm going to write, whether they get it or not. Not going to be gentle anymore because I think we've gone past gentility in our civilization, at least in this country. So that's been a big impact on the way I view myself as what I write and how I write it.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Cheryl. Sassafras.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in this conversation, so many things in the last, 12 months have impacted the way that I think about writing, the way that I write. Certainly, as we're talking about the pandemic, I left New York 2.5 years ago, but so much of my social and literary community is still in New York. And so, being on the West Coast now, as the pandemic hit New York so hard, it was this very strange juxtaposition of people here at the time weren't necessarily taking it super seriously, while I was watching people being very impacted and getting very sick in New York. And so that was just strange creatively. Especially, I write a lot about queer community and what does that look like? What does that mean in a global pandemic? Similar to, Cheryl, we were talking before we started recording about the world of the Trump administration and how I feel like all of this stacks together in ways that I had been thinking about my queer work for, the last 4+ years. And, after the 2016 election, the way that I wasn't sure how I wanted to do queer work anymore, what that would look like. And in particular, thinking about a lot of the work I had done had been sort of like pushing back on homonormative things and ideas and community. And that felt really fraught to do when it seemed like the entire LGBTQ plus community was under attack by the Trump administration. And suddenly I didn't want to be part of an sort of like an infighting piece. And then absolutely thinking about, we're going to talk about, where my voice belongs as a white queer writer, thinking about the impact of social justice movements and Black Lives Matter and how that has shifted work that I do and don't want to do and where I do and don't want to put my voice.
Yeah, beautiful. Excellent. Yeah, the term doom scrolling is very much in the news now, and I did a lot of that in the last 12 months. And I think, in terms of Donald Trump and, the whole, like the last 4 years of that, the 4 years of that administration, it's sort of like, I think we're looking for justice, It's like the narrative must end with justice. There must be some justice. And I think for myself, I kept thinking, now's the moment when there will be justice. And it hasn't come at this point. So, And I think those narratives, again, political narratives, social narratives, we as writers see them differently, right? Because we're storytellers and
Yeah.
we see these things sort of play out. And, it's, the old cliche about, life being stranger than, fiction sometimes. And I do think that we've experienced a lot of sort of out of this world, crazy things in the last 12 months that as writers, I think our perspective on those things is very, unique. And
Yeah.
it certainly, in some ways, could even distract from our work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the doom scrolling thing is interesting to me because I think more people got introduced to queer life and queer community, straight people, than ever have before in this last 12 years because they got time on their hands and Netflix and they can't go to work. So they're going to watch every queer thing. It might not have happened in March, but I think by June they were trying everything. So I think our work got the benefit of that, our TV shows, our films, our books, our movies. But I do think at the same time, this issue around justice is what I came to know about midway through this thing is that we have to create our own justice. So
Right.
I'm writing crime and mystery stories. So I'm already focused on what justice looks like to me as a Black queer writer and how that's different from how Michael Connolly sees justice. So I was already in the path of helping people to see there's a different way to look at how justice applies minority communities and disenfranchised communities and queer communities and others. But now I'm really focused on um, grabbing a narrative that says, I don't care how you see justice, this is the way it has to be for me and mine. And if you can't get with that, screw you. So it's kind of like a more definitive flag in the ground kind of focus on seeing things differently, helping people to see things differently. But if they can't, we have to keep moving.
Yeah, I love that idea of it being sort of, also someone just who wants to just enjoy a novel or a mystery.
Yeah.
There might just be this sort of, this underlying theme, that they're just enjoying the book, right? But they might get something more than just a story out of it,
I think
something
they
more
better
valuable.
get something more.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that. I think that's beautiful. So Sassafras, I'm just curious to know. So you moved to Portland before the pandemic, before the world went insane, and I'm just curious to know: how have you found the literary community there in Portland versus New York? Have you found it very active or?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm not sure yet.
Uh-huh.
Is my first answer. I did move here 2 years ago, so a little bit before the pandemic started. Um, and I think that when I say I'm not sure, I think that it has a lot of similarities in terms of the kinds of literary community that I was involved with in New York, which was mostly indie queer authors and small press queer authors. And I think that there is a lot of that here. And I think that also, though, so much of my literary community hasn't been centered on where I lived, even though I lived in New York. So I know that sounds weird to say, but because of conferences like Saints and Sinners and things that so many um, author friends of mine or people that I would collaborate with were already spread across the US, across Canada. And so the benefit of New York was that pretty much all their book tours would come to New York. And some of those book tours still came to Portland. And so that was really fun to be able to collaborate or go to those kinds of things here. But I think that literary community hasn't necessarily been permanently affixed to a specific space for me.
Yeah.
But I'm still getting my bearings on what it looks like in Portland, and I think it's going to look so different after
Sure,
this.
sure. And it's interesting too to think about, where we are in our lives, at a particular moment and how those world events might or might not have the same, influence. In your case, you had the move and then you have all these things happening, before probably you were fully settled in. Also, this idea too of the world being, sorry, this global world in which we live, where and Cheryl, you sort of mentioned this about people accessing more movies, more books during the pandemic. It's the idea of place, right? Where do we need to be for a writing career? Maybe those or any career for that matter. It may just matter much less than it did before. So, Cheryl, what have been your biggest challenges as a writer in the last 12 months? And are those challenges, perhaps the same as they would have been, 2 years before, 3 years before? Were there any
Mhm.
unique challenges?
Mhm. Well, the interesting thing for me is I'm an introvert, and unlike Sassafras, I've not missed being around a gaggle of people so much, So that part felt pretty good to me. And in some ways, those first few months walking around the world as a writer, with the distance was good, the mask was good. I'm going like, I could do this actually. Um, but I started seeing relationships differently because they were enacting differently. So I'd go for walks with the dogs, people socially distanced. You could see the extroverts coming. You could see them at 2 miles away or a block away because they were just so eager to see another person. So, I'm walking the dogs, and white men who wouldn't normally say a darn thing to me would go like, "Hi, how you doing?" And lean in, so eager to make a, so eager to make a connection. So I'm observing that. I'm observing how in the world the animals are acting differently without the noise of so much traffic, without the noise of so many people around, when people are staying away from them. That was really different the first few months. So that's another observation I made. Um, the focus was a problem because you're bombarded with all the messages of the doomsday of COVID and the social justice stuff, and so it was, and I'm a news junkie, so it was kind of hard to keep my focus. That was a little different, so I had to put some of that away. My partner was just saying, I can't stand to watch him, turn it off. And I wanted to still be engaged. So that's been the biggest problem for me, is the focus. So being compartmentalized, getting a little place for myself and a space for myself where I can really focus on the writing.
Yeah, yeah. And Cheryl, so is that so in your career, any career activities outside of your writing life? I'm just curious to know if you look back, like say 10 years ago, was finding did you still have to try as hard to carve out that space for your
Yeah.
creativity? No.
No, I'm a morning person. I write better in the morning. I have really good energy and really good curiosity about things in the morning. And in the evening, I'm more observing. I notice I talk less.
Mhm.
People can talk to me. They think that they've had a wonderful conversation with me at 4 o'clock because I'm going like, I'm not saying anything.
Right, right, yeah, yeah.
So that was easier before these times. As an introvert, you've got the work of selling books and connecting with people. I've been busier on Zoom in my little square than I have ever before, doing live book tours and all that stuff. So, and as a minority writer, just like people were interested in queer things, they were really interested in social justice and Black writers and Black stuff. So it was a great time to be a Black person and a Black writer in America. We had I don't know if the window's about to close, probably,
Mm.
but we had a little window there where people were calling me and asking my advice. Will you be on this panel? Would you read my book? Can you blurb my book, and that kind of thing? So I'm hoping that's more than a trend. I'm hoping it's a paradigm shift as new readers got to read our stuff. Hopefully that will be the case.
Yes, and the idea of if you feel like your voice hasn't been heard,
Yeah,
for so long, or an entire community feels that way, and then you finally are able to have people understand you and understand your point of view, it can be very, very powerful.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So, Sassafras, I want to hear about your challenges, but I just wanted to just say one more thing about this idea of where we should be focused. I think also that's the challenge when you see crisis in the world, and then as writers, I think sometimes we feel like, maybe we shouldn't be writing a story or a poem or a novel. We should be out there doing something else, or doing something more charitable, or, talking to a friend who might be ill with COVID or whatever it might be, and taking that creative time for ourselves. It's sort of a gift. And sometimes I feel like I know in my own life, I don't often allow myself that as much as I should. So, yeah, so Cheryl, thank you. You made me think about that. Sassafras, challenges. What's been challenging for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, sort of starting, I'm a profound introvert, like an extreme profound introvert. And so the life of the pandemic, my partner commented me the other week and was like, this is like your ideal. I mean, obviously without the like scary like health crisis globally, but like it is like, I'm very happy to like stay in my house and like hang out with my pets and not go anywhere and not have to see anybody. And for years, my social network has existed so much virtually on social media. I love social media. I love connecting with people that way. It's very comfortable for me. So that's been great. Unlike what I know a lot of people have experienced, but it's been a very strange 12 months. 3 years ago, well, I guess not 3 years ago now, but when I quit my day job, I published 5-6 books at that point, and I went and got an MFA. And I graduated the week before the world went into lockdown. And so it was a very strange moment to have gone back to school, done this MFA, focused on queer fairy tales and queer fiction, and then to graduate into what felt like this very strange, surreal landscape. So like that's something that's been, grappling with. And then simultaneously, the way that I feel like space and literary space and queer literary space has been shifted and impacted in some ways really excitingly, like the way that this conference is virtual. And I know I have readers in the UK who are so excited to be able to attend, who would have never been able to travel to New Orleans for a queer conference. And that's exciting for writers. But also I think what I'm really thinking about are sort of those not organized spaces and how those have been impacted. Time Hop, which, like as a Remembery app you can get on your phone that'll like remind you of things you've posted on social media, reminded me like a week ago about a reading that I had done with an author in New York who had traveling through. And it reminded me of what I didn't post. And what I didn't post is that after the reading, we'd gone to dinner. And it was because of that dinner and those conversations that happened that I now know was what led to them telling Arsenal Pulp Press that they needed to talk to me, which is what led to my book, Lost Boy, being published by Arsenal Pulp. And it's that kind of conversation. It's the, the hallway conversations at Saints and Sinners where I met Mike Ford, who's one of my best writing friends now. And it was because we had a conversation about our chihuahuas in the hallway. And then we went and got breakfast together in New Orleans, things that can't quite translate to the virtual space. As much as I love virtual spaces, that's kind of, I think, when I think about challenges of the last year, something that is continuing to factor into my mind.
Sure. Yeah, and I remember. I think I saw you with Michael at the Lambda Literary Awards a few years ago, and you all did some bingo card, right? Some bingo game for the the Lammies. It was fun. I remember seeing you there. So, hi Daniel, welcome.
Daniel.
So Daniel's joining us, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. So. Daniel, we're just talking about challenges of the last 12 months, and Sassafras was just sharing. So, Sassafras, this idea of interaction with others, in real spaces and, in real time, I think is very essential. I think that, if we are introverted, while it might be more comfortable for us to interact with others less, it's sometimes when we're forced to be extroverted that those friendships and those sort of changes and life changes come about. That may be. I'm just again, I'm curious to know what's gonna if we're gonna continue to be like this. I've already seen what several companies, including some of the places, some of the schools I teach at, are considering putting more classes online, just, even though they don't have to after the pandemic, moving in that direction. I think that there's something, even if you go into an office, just interacting with someone in person, there's a creativity at play that maybe we don't have so much. Or maybe it's just different, maybe it's equal, maybe it's just different. Yeah.
And I think in some ways there's some beautiful things that have come out of it. I think it's that paradoxical push-pull for me. I've also had the opportunity to visit some amazing queer studies high school classrooms across the country who their school budgets could never have possibly made it possible to fly me in a non-pandemic world, but they were able to make it possible for me to come to a school visit. And so, and I've seen so many other authors and creators be able to do that and be able to connect with people in environments where that just wouldn't have been possible. So I think it's this, how do we keep both is in a post-COVID world would be my hope. How do we figure out that balance.
In Sassafras, what I've found is that I'm having deeper conversations with people I've known a long time. You know, when you're out for a drink at a bar, there's all the stuff around you going on, the distraction. But I've been meeting weekly with a bunch of girlfriends just to check on each other, and I'm learning things about them I didn't know, and I've known them for 30 effing years. So.
Yeah. And Cheryl, it also speaks to that idea of, this global world and us all being connected as well, So I think that I know for myself, when I think about technology and doing things virtually, I often think that it's either better or worse, and I always gauge it, in those terms, as opposed to just being different, And again, as Sassafras noted, there are some positive things about it, right? And then there are also some, some challenges. So I'm going to introduce Daniel. I'm just going to ask how, what his challenges have been, and then we're going to move on to the next question. So Daniel, welcome. I'll choose your bio, okay? Daniel W.K. Lee is a third-generation refugee born in Kuching, is that correct? Okay.
Yep.
Kuching, Malaysia, and raised in Chicagoland. He moved to New York City in 1996, where he earned a BA at NYU and an MFA in creative writing at the New School. As did I. Daniel relocated to Seattle in March 2014, and after a little over 5 years in the Pacific Northwest, he moved to New Orleans in December 2019. His debut collection of poetry, Anatomy of Want, great title, was published by Rebel Satori Press, Queer Mojo, it's a wonderful small publisher, in November 2019. So you're in good hands there. Sven is a wonderful person, so it's a great publisher. So Daniel, you want to just jump in and tell us, how you've been and what have been your challenges over the last 12 months?
Obviously I have a little bit of COVID brain, thinking it was going to be 1:00, and then I looked at the Zoom thing, and it was 1:00 Eastern time. So
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry about that.
You're good. I'm glad to have you. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things was, I moved to New Orleans just before COVID struck. So December 4th, I'd landed in New Orleans. And so I kind of got like 4 months or so of I got Mardi Gras in, attempting to socialize and meet people. And then, lockdown came. And then I thought I would be experience a lot of isolation. I'm a very extroverted type person. So I thought I would suffer a lot, but in fact, it wasn't that bad. It's been a very it's been a kind of blessing in disguise, because I'm such an extroverted person. The kind of constriction of like my social sphere has allowed me to kind of focus on writing.
Uh-huh.
And if anything, it's kind of like affirmed my sense of like adaptability, considering kind of all the things that have been going on in the world. So it's kind of been an odd blessing in this chaos.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so before you joined us, Sassafras was, talking about how she moved to Portland just, a couple of years before, right, Sassafras, and before the pandemic. And also Cheryl and Sassafras talking about being more introverted. And so it's just great to have a contrast to that. So Cheryl, I'm wondering, about, we were talking just a few moments ago about the idea of, being out in the world versus being, virtual. And, what I've been, thinking about is how that might manifest itself into the actual content, so from aside our actual, how we get it done, the task of writing. I know when I see television shows and there's like a crowd of people or, a small group of people hugging, I'm like, wait, why? Don't do that. You're going to get COVID. It's like, oh, wait, this is before the pandemic. That's right. The world's not like that all the time. There's just a pandemic right now. So I'm curious to know, how might the pandemic, you've talked a little bit about the events, the racial justice and injustice that's been, sort of exposed in the last year. But how else might we see the world event show up in your writing in the near future?
Well, I tell you, the COVID has just kind of helped consolidate my thinking about this. It gave me the time and the space to do it. But February, I was incensed by the George Floyd murder. And so after a wave of these murders, all of 2019 and beyond, I decided to, I'm sorry to keep being so angry about this, but
Please,
I
no,
decided to let
please. I
my
love it.
anger,
That's what we want.
be a driving force for my writing. And I have not done that before. In fact, in my writing, I feel like I'm not always giving enough of my internal self. I appreciate poets who do that all the time. But I felt like I wasn't doing that. And my anger and my acceptance of it gave me permission to do that.
Wow.
So I feel like it's made me a better writer. It's not that I'm more reflective or internally aligned. It's that I'm allowing what I know to be true to spill out on the pages in a different way, with franker language, with more energy, as I said earlier, with less of a concern about the white gaze. And so I think the writing is just more authentic. I think I think I'm turning into a race woman, and I'm not mad about it. So that's been a good thing for me as a creator.
That's beautiful. Yeah, there's a depth there, is what I'm hearing, as it really touched a nerve, that there's something at the core of
Yeah.
who you are. Um, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Sassafras, how about you? How might the events of the past 12 months show up in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm trying to figure that out still on some level. I think, in terms of like my commercial work, as I talked about at the beginning, the pandemic has been very, very centered in sort of like the dog writing that I do. But in terms of like my creative queer work, I'm still figuring that out a little bit. As I said, I graduated and I finished my MFA, and I now have this, book that was my thesis that is all about queer community, culture, belonging, which is like all the themes that I've played with in all of my past books. But I think more than any of them, this book is about togetherness in a way that I don't know how to sell in a 2021 world. So I'm sitting and I'm trying to figure that out of how do I talk to a publisher about a book about belonging and connection and community together. So that's something I don't have the answer to. So it's sitting on my hard drive, not quite sure where to go with it. And then I think, just thinking again about 2020, I guess we're 2021 now, but, in light of the last 4 years, in light of all these things coming together, I'm thinking a lot about where my voice is relevant, where my voice is useful, where it's time for me to take my hands off the keyboard and not actually say anything as a writer. That happened sort of like all at these same times. A lot of my past work was looking at queer youth homelessness as a formerly homeless queer youth, but also thinking about how my position as a white queer person, I actually walked away from a book deal with a New York press and sent back the advance.
Wow.
Right before all of this happened, pandemic wise, recognizing both I didn't like the direction they wanted the book to go after we were a year into working on it, and also that it needed to be written by a queer, formerly homeless writer of color and not by me. And so those are all just, it all feels interconnected to the last 12 months, even if it's stuff that was happening just sort of like right before that to me.
Sure.
Yeah. So a lot of, I don't know where,
Yeah.
where
Well,
my queer
also,
work.
sure. And I mean, sometimes it's hard to have those delineations, right, between month to month. And so, and it's hard for us to sometimes carve out even mentally time periods. So, but I'm thinking also about this idea of, how we often, there's this idea that, like a painter sits by the mountain and paints the mountains. Sometimes they do that. For writers, it's not always about sitting by the mountains writing about the mountains. It's about going to the mountains, and then 5 years later you're sitting down and there's something that shows up on the page or emerges subconsciously, but you don't even know where it came from, but it came from that experience, while you're at the mountains. And so sometimes I just think like you said, we don't know how it's going to show up. And I think it's beautiful when we can recognize it, but we don't always know. So thank you. Daniel, how about you? As a poet, I can imagine this is even more complex.
Yeah, I think personally, the kind of the events that have been happening, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and then recently, of course, all this anti-Asian violence that's been kind of going on, like the work has become like more explicitly and directly influenced by those things. And because I guess I've been a little bit more sensitive to it to a degree, even though, I kind of feel like I mean, my privileges and like kind of allow me to kind of feel like give me a little bit of buffer from a certain amount of that direct experience. But like my poetry, like recently I wrote a poem, no, not that recently, but during the pandemic, this pandemic, I wrote a piece of spoken word about COVID-19. I don't think I've written any spoken word in 10 years. And it was really a great kind of form to kind of channel that anger and frustration, social and political hypocrisy. And also, I've been crafting these poems. It started even before pandemic, where I'm kind of like borrowing the voices of stories or narratives about from journalistic pieces. I'll hear something like a story of so and so. For example, Christopher Villalba, who was, I think, the first man to die, to be executed in federal prison in over 30 some years. And I was listening to a podcast, The Intercepted, kind of talking about how the then Trump administration and Attorney General Barr have been basically on a killing spree in the last month of the administration or regime, if you'd like. And so there was a piece about that, and there was a letter that they read that he had, or a card that he had written to his mother, and that she had received after he had been executed. And so it's like stories like these stories, sad as they are, kind of been kind of very inspiring. So I wrote a poem about that called Cherry Trees. And so I've been kind of like trying to, and actually very intentionally, especially with my next manuscript for my next book, I'm actually focus on these kind of more political poems that are driven by these like personal narratives, whether they're like true journalistic real life or fictional. So yeah, it's been an interesting moment creatively to kind of take those raw emotions and those feelings and craft them in a way that isn't necessarily like the subject matter of like my last book, which is all about desire and love and everything like that.
So Daniel, I just want to interject here that it's just connecting that to what Cheryl was saying regarding race and identity and how it's more vital in her work than before. And so I just think being aware of that when you're working it can be something very empowering. And just in terms of, I think, the purpose of art in the world, right? Whether or not it matters, does art matter? These types of philosophical questions are always around. It's sort of like, I think, today, just hearing from everyone, it's a reminder that, whether writing, whether it's, Black voices, Asian voices, queer voices, the idea is that it's super essential right now because, I'm hearing that all of you have you already had a calling as writers, but there's clearly something very deep, in terms of what you're tapping into right now. And I think even people, who didn't necessarily even think about writing anything politically before might find that in their work. Of course, we're talking about it, so it's coming to the surface in this conversation, but perhaps there are people who, other writers watching this who may not even realize the politics, right, or the identity sort of concepts that are showing up or might show up in their art because of the last 12 months.
One thing that comes up for me in listening to both Sassafras and Daniel is when sometimes in these moments, what occurs after this tragedy is this moment of illumination and kind of spiritual enlightenment. And that's why I'm thinking, Sassafras, this is a great time to put your book out about unity and belonging, because I think people, I know I want it. After seeing the people tear down the Capitol, I want to know how we put it all back together again. I really do.
Yeah, and I should clarify, I think some of the challenge with that book is that it's a fiction, it's a novel, and it's like a novel like of a very large community, like interwoven. And so yeah, I think that was more so the piece that feels hard of like, how do we, to that idea, I think most of us have had that experience, we're talking about of watching TV and, seeing a group of people and we're like, oh my God, you can't hug,
Yeah.
you can't do that, you're gonna get
Yeah.
COVID. And so I think that's more that sticking point that I feel where I'm like, how do I try to sell a book right now to a publisher that's about a bunch of people living in a punk house together and like doing things in community?
Yeah, and whether or not it's changed the public's perception, right, when they see art, or do they have COVID on their minds too? Has it
Yeah.
shifted people's thinking about interaction, physically?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's so interesting to see how that will play out. I'm curious to know, for me, I'll just say, like, I've been into like Miley Cyrus and documentaries and podcasts the last 12 months. That's what's kept me going and inspired me. And Cheryl, I'd like to know, like, what artists, other writers, TV shows, what art has inspired you, or what artists or creators have inspired you in the last 12 months?
Mhm. Well, I tell you, I didn't go down the route of escapism so much. I heard people talking about wanting to see, this Netflix, fantasy piece, and I didn't go there. I just couldn't. But I got really deeply involved in binge watching a couple of crime series since I write crime. I was really, thinking about the dark side of humanity. I guess I binge watched the True Detective series,
Uh-huh.
which is an excellent piece of writing and an excellent piece of producing. I have a background in broadcast, TV and film, and it's produced really well. So I got involved in that. I've been listening to a lot more music, online concerts and things. I'm a big Broadway nerd. So I've been watching every attempt by anybody who sings or performs on Broadway to do something online. It's really hard. I've seen some done really well, and seen some that was really crappy, you know. And then I've been reading a lot of poetry, and Daniel, I want to say I love poets. Whenever I get stuck writing, I stop and read poetry to open myself up, you know. And I heard a poet just this morning at a reading, and she had a phrase that made me connect to it in a kind of spiritual way. And she said, "I am the mass in massacre." And I went, "Yeah, that's right." So I leave that for you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Beautiful. Sassafras, how about you? Inspirations or inspirers, if you will?
Yeah, I think that for me, what I've been consuming has been so much also a product of, like, as I mentioned, that I'd had this very weird experience of going back to school in my mid 30s to get an MFA, and I graduated again right before the pandemic ended. And so it was all of a sudden like, I can read anything I want now. I'm not in school anymore. What is this like? And so I've and then the pandemic. So I think that a lot of what I've been consuming are things that I've let myself, some things that I find really pleasurable and not having any guilt about it. I think that fairy tales play a really big role in the work that I do, and sort of like pulling fracturings of those together. I think Shannon McGuire's Wayward Children series is doing some really cool things and some really not so subtle queer things, though it's not marketed as queer work, which I find incredibly fascinating from like a publishing and writing perspective. So that's been a binge. Amy Ray of the Indigo Girls, her very politically engaged, savvy country solo albums have definitely been like a soundtrack to the work that I've been doing. I've been thinking about those from like Holler and Muscadine. And then I think the other, also just like in a totally not guilty way, something that has always really creatively inspired me is prolificness. And Taylor Swift, however people feel about her, I happen to really like her music, just like on a musical level, dropping 2 albums, being recorded in her home in the pandemic, just on a creative level, regardless of what you think about her, I find really inspiring, just because I find prolific creativity to be very, very, something I aspire to.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah, it's amazing the amount of work she's able to produce, and I think she's our like, she's like a modern day Carole King, I think, in a way. So, um, also, I just want to interject this idea of highbrow, lowbrow. Sometimes I feel like we can get wrapped up, as a society about that. And Duke Ellington once said, "If it sounds good, it is good." And so I just love that idea of like, if it works, it works. It doesn't have to be always high-minded. Daniel, how about you?
I've definitely gone more the route of escapism, and I don't really have any shame or qualms about that. The drag queens Trixie Mattel and Katya Zamolotchkova,
Hmm.
all of their content from their web series to Queens You Like to Watch and their podcasts, they've just, I mean, they're so insane. Like their content just like mummifies me. I'm just dead from them. It's great. I love it. Um, Early in the pandemic, I binge watched the final season of Schitt's Creek, which is just beautiful, like funny but wonderful storytelling. And then later on, I watched the animated show Archer, which is just kind of also this off-color humor that I super enjoy. Um, I listen to a lot of music as well. The music of a local traditional jazz band here in New Orleans named Tuba Skinny. Um, they released this quarantine album, and I've kind of listened to that like just maybe like once a week. It's really been that amazing. Also, Donny Hathaway, if you're a lover of old soul, they just released the digital recording of his Live at the Bitter End album from 1971 just yesterday. And it's dead ass amazing. And I've been listening to it like nonstop since yesterday. It's so fantastic. Just, I don't think Donny Hathaway is getting enough credit in the world, in the music world, and just in general. And I have a friend also in New York City that goes by the name Jay Criv. He did this remix of Renee and Angela's I'll Be Good."
Hmm.
And especially early in the pandemic, I would just put that track on and just dance by myself in the kitchen and do my cooking or whatever it was. It was truly wonderful. But I did have like moments where I was like, I need to also go engage. And another person I would say that doesn't get enough credit is Audre Lorde. And I revisited her essay collection, Sister Outsider. And as much, I just think people need to be reading her as much as they're, reading Baldwin, as much as they're reading, Robin DiAngelo, or, if want to talk about anti-racism and intersectionality and thinking about our, multi-issue lives, people need to be reading Audre Lorde, her essays, her poetry, everything. She was prolific, insightful, and she was dedicated to the craft of writing.
Yes,
And
yes. I agree.
I mean,
agree.
she just needs to be on curriculum, school curriculum. She's fantastic.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, Audre Lorde is fantastic.
And Daniel's blowing me away with his knowledge of R&B too. Renee and Angela.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that people don't expect that from me too. They're like, this kid, what? I mean, I'm much older than I appear, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So, we could talk about this for hours. I could do this all day because there's like 50 questions that have, come to mind. But we have a time limit. So I just was wondering if maybe you would all like to perhaps share maybe just a paragraph of something new, or a stanza, if you will, if you're a poet, in Daniel's case. So would you all like to just share something and tell us maybe, what it's from, or when we might see it in the future, or where we might see it, and then we'll call it a wrap. So Cheryl, do you want to share something with us?
Sure. During the pandemic, I wrote a story that I've been carrying around with me for a long time. My great-great-grandfather was killed by Birmingham, Alabama police back in 1929. And in my anger, I thought, okay, now's the time to write this story, to make some parallels between 2019, to avoid COVID, and 1929. So that 90-year span, and looking at the historical and systemic violence against Black bodies by police forces. And so this is a short paragraph, 5 lines, 3 sentences, one really long one, from that novel that's a work in progress. The manuscript's done. It's called Time's Undoing. My grandmother, Willie Mae Harrington, has been Black in America a long time. She's 92 and wields the number like a waving flag on the crest of a conquered hill. She's lived through the Depression, moved from the South to find the promised opportunities of the North, married a soldier returning from World War II, voted for Dwight Eisenhower, raised children with tough love, shifted her political allegiances to John F. Kennedy, cried over the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and cried again for joy at the election of Barack Obama.
Wow, fantastic. Oh my goodness. And it's sort of like everything that you talked about earlier today is, I can see it in those sentences there. Wow, it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. Sassafras.
Sure. So this is a paragraph from early on that I've been reworking in this novel, which is working title called The Basket, that I don't know what press is going to buy it. So well, that's where it'll go someday. We'll see. This is the house that Alice built. It is home to strays of all sorts who find their way home. Here's the family they have built. On the first floor, the hardwoods shine old, shag carpet pulled up to reveal the gouged but glimmer of honey-colored wood that Victorian babies once walked across. There is a bedroom that used to be a sitting room, a living room where traveling bands of riot girls crash on blankets and in sleeping bags, laying out couch cushions, the pillow forts of slumber parties they were never invited to as children.
Wow. Wow, my goodness. The details there. I just want to sit back and just have you all read to me for like the rest of the day. This is so great. Thank you so much, Sassafras. Daniel, something from the past 12 months that you've created or reworked that you want to share?
Yeah, I have a very short poem, so I'm going to read the whole thing. It's called The Whole Thing. It's for George Floyd. Please, Mama, I'm through, knee crushed, some with exit wounds, some with puncture wounds, which don't breathe, yet the death gasps revive grief's embers, and tears, rage's accelerant, incinerate the whole thing, even God, over and over.
Wow, thank you. Fantastic. I'm so glad that we wrapped up that way, because I just love having those words just sort of, hang in the air. They're very, very powerful, and yeah, and again, very representative of everything that we discussed. So I'm very moved. Thank you all so much for joining me for this panel, and I hope that we can be in New Orleans. I know you are in New Orleans, Daniel. I hope the rest of us can be down there in New Orleans in person next year with the Saints and Sinners Festival. Thank
You are
so
three
much.
people I would really want to hang out with as an introvert.
I can be exhausting, I'll tell you that.
We're going to come see you. So thank you all so much, and have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice to meet you both, all three of you, actually. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.